do something a little bit different again today. Some advanced work, I suppose you might call it. This is a guitar from a builder named Ron Belanger. I suppose Americans might pronounce it Belanger. Don't. Ron was working in a beautiful little town called Orillia, which is a bit more than 100 miles north of me. I would love to spend some more time in Orillia. Ron is, I believe, recently retired. He started building in the late 90s, making all kinds of stuff. I occasionally see his guitars come up for sale, and there's lots of variation in the materials he was using and various designs. And I had my hands on one of his Irish bouzoukis about 15 years ago now, I think. And it was really nicely crafted, as I remember. He'd used a pin bridge rather than a tailpiece, which is the way to go for those instruments. I've been told that he was a protege of Grit Laskin. We've discussed Grit before. We will again. Patreon people, don't worry, I haven't forgotten. I just need to figure out how much sleep I can give up to get that project done. But yeah, there are certain Grit-like aspects to this guitar. Anyway, the owner of this instrument had a great experience with Ron, who worked with him to get the neck into a shape that he liked. However, over the years, hand problems have arisen, and the neck is now uncomfortable. It's too thin, yet too wide. And he's got a tailor which has a neck that really suits him, and he wants to know if I can transform this into something more like that. I've done some orthopedic guitar work before, changing the ergonomics of the neck for a person who'd lost their thumb. In that case, it involved adding a bunch of thickness. It looked and felt like the business end of a baseball bat. In this case, considering the size and shape we're dealing with, we're pretty much stuck with building a new neck. People will occasionally come to me and ask if I can change the neck profile on their Les Paul, for instance. The thing to know is there's a truss rod in there, and it comes very close to the back of the neck. There's only a couple of millimeters of wood over it in the center. In this case, we have a rod that's double action, and that too usually takes up a whole bunch of room in there. So thinning a neck down in most cases is impossible, or at least ill-advised, because the wood gets too thin, then you go to adjust the truss rod and it'll crack right through the back of the neck. Making it thicker is tricky too, because we need to, first of all, make a flat spot to glue the wood to. You know, it's not impossible, but in reality we'd end up cutting away a huge amount of wood on both sides and a strip on top too, not unlike what I do with those headstock reconstructions, but full length. And we're left with usually like a 3-piece assembly. It gets really messy, and it's quite difficult to carve, and it's very time consuming. And in most cases, probably not worth it. You might be better off searching for a guitar with a neck that you appreciate, especially if it's a factory-built guitar. So, like I say, not an inexpensive procedure. Crafting it so it'll work with the scale length, it has to be very precise. I think that goes without saying, but I'm not sure the non-repair people really understand what that entails to get this thing at exactly the right length so, you know, you don't have to move the bridge and everything functions properly. Materials in this are pretty nice. I'm not sure how well it shows up on camera, but there's a lot of bear claw in this top. Bear claw is an aberration in the growth lines. It looks like a bear has clawed it, but it's not because of that. It's some genetic thing. Quite beautiful. We have a rosette from spalted maple with a line of pearl. No outside defining line on that pearl. That's very modern. Kind of a diminutive bridge. Elegant. This instrument is from 2014. The body is quite large. It's 16 1/8 across the lower bout there, so it's bigger than your average dreadnought. And, you know, nice piece of Indian rosewood for back and sides. Traditional in a lot of ways. There's a sound port to look through. Fairly standard X bracing. These braces, however, seem to have a lamination down the center. I imagine that's carbon fiber, which is an idea, actually goes back to around the turn of the 20th century. the Larson brothers were making X-braced guitars with a lamination of Brazilian rosewood in there. The idea to stiffen it up considerably and therefore get smaller braces, which have less mass and therefore more volume, hopefully. Seems to be a K&K installed, but nothing too surprising. The neck on this thing is on the wider range of normal. It's a full 1 3/4 at the nut, which is around 44 millimeters. I also like to measure at the 12th fret here, and this is 2 13/64, which is around 56 millimeters, thereabouts, 56.5. The string spread at the saddle is around 57 millimeters, 2 1/4 inches, which normally you'll find that the total width at the 12th fret is about the same as the string spread on the saddle. We have a bolt-on neck, which could be advantageous. I'm trying to sort of recreate a neck with a dovetail. Different people have different standards in terms of the angle of the dovetail and its size, and it's not always that easy to replicate, but hopefully this isn't too difficult.
I'll remove the fingerboard extension, which was glued down with aliphatic wood glue. Came off without too much complaint. The scale length is about 643 millimeters, which is about 25 5/16. I'll measure the neck's thickness at various points. The frets are showing significant amount of play wear. I'm measuring the headstock angle, which is about 14 degrees. It's a very reasonable number.
We can have a look at this attachment system. And when I do this, I don't want you to get the idea that I'm trying to pick on the builder or be mean about it. This is just the kind of simple post-mortem every repair person does. The info is useful. So this is the inverse of what could be described as the early Taylor system for bolt-on necks. Got 2 bolts, but in this case the male end is in the heel. Usually it's the other way around. There'll be insert nuts in the heel and the bolts go through the neck block. These are what's known as a hanger bolt. They have a coarse thread on one side, usually used in wood, and a machine screw thread on the other. You can see that there's a crack that is formed right down the center of the heel, and that's because these are pulling against a wood dowel that's been sunk down the length of the heel through the end, which is something I agree with. It's something I do on my own guitars that use a bolt-on neck. On heels like this, there's not a whole lot of grain there, and it's not very difficult for cracks to develop through the heel if it's knocked or something. In fact, you can see this dark stain up here. That is super glue, thin glue, and if we turn it over, you can see that there was a crack that developed through the end here. Now a dowel can provide some resistance and strength, and it also gives the threads of the bolt something to grip into that isn't end grain. You know, this is not a particularly great surface to sink screws into. It's very weak, and in some cases you just want to pull right out. When putting the neck on, there's a tendency to really want to reef down on those nuts and cinch everything super tight. That can be a little bit dangerous. If there's any headspace between the heel and the body, as there usually is, we usually make it slightly hollow to allow for easier fitting of the parts around their perimeter. You know, we want them tight in the visible area. If we assemble a neck in the dead of winter, the parts will be at their smallest natural dimensions from dryness. Even if we're using a humidifier, it still happens. When summer comes along, the neck block can swell and increase in width, putting even more strain on those bolts that have been tightened to their nth degree and the wood surrounding them, and this is kind of what can happen. So we want it snug, not super tight. Unfortunately, that means that they might loosen a bit at some point and need retightening, which is not something people really want to think about having their customers do. but that's part of life with a bolt-on neck. There's some funny stuff going on in the fretboard. Ghostly reminders of a misspent youth. Seems like the 12th fret dots were initially placed a fret away from where they should have been. And also, one of these seems to have been re-drilled as well. These things happen. A question arises. Should I try and remove the old fretboard and plane it down into the new dimensions? These frets are worn enough that I'd probably want to refret it anyway, so that's not out of the question. But there's a balance to be struck. Like, would it take longer to do that and be more of a hassle than simply fabricating a new one from scratch? It's hard to say. I've had it go both ways. There is something to the idea of preserving a piece of the guitar's history, which I like. And the board itself is in decent shape. It's dirty, but the surface is pretty good. Here's the subject to be replicated. This is a Taylor Custom GS. The scale length is about 2 millimeters longer. I don't think that's going to cause too much of an issue. This is one of those 9-string oddities. I believe I've worked on one of these before. The nut width is the same, 1 3/4, 44 millimeters. At the 12th fret, however, actually 1.5 millimeters in front of it, we're significantly narrower. That's only 54 millimeters rather than 56. String spacing at the bridge is the same, 2 1/4. Look at the spacing though. Because he's playing this as a 6-string. Oh, that's interesting. He's using the first pin at the bridge, but he's using the second string slot at the headstock. So this string is actually angled. It gets closer to the E string as it gets towards the bridge. That's strange. There's much less taper in this neck as well. There's only about 0.5 millimeters taper.
I'll take measurements using this profile gauge, which has a bunch of little plastic fingers that slide down and recreate the shape.
This is only an approximation, of course. It's not super fine, but it'll give me basic geometry that I can measure from. I've made allowances for the thickness of the fretboard. The Taylor is not so flattened in profile. It's more of like a deep C.
I heated up the old fretboard and pulled it off. I'll try and reuse the truss rod, so I have to remove the filler strip. Out it comes. Then I'll remove the bolts so I can copy the heel profile. I'll just trace around that, then derive a center line from which I can work. The material for the neck is a piece of Honduras mahogany. This is a 4/4 board, which means it started off rough cut at about 1 inch thick. I'll plane that down flat and clean on both sides. I want one of the edges clean and straight and true and perpendicular to one of the faces. I'll transfer the appropriate thickness at the 1st and 10th frets. And I'll plane the taper into the board. You can see I've already cut off the headstock angle there. It'll be a scarf joint. I'll plane the gluing surface into the headstock side of things. I drill 2 holes for little wooden pegs, which I use to maintain the position of the parts together while the glue is in there and they're being clamped so they don't slide around too much. Using the bandsaw, I cut off the head plate, leaving a little bit of mahogany on the underside, and here you can see where I ruined the blade by running it directly into those carbon fiber strips. I don't want to try and hand plane through those, so I will excavate them before thicknessing. The original neck had a backstrap overlay of rosewood, so I decided to try and duplicate the effect. I'm creating a bit of a curved sort of volute between the thin section of the headstock and the thicker part of the neck proper. I'm actually going to do this glue up in 2 parts because it's kind of tricky. And lots of glue, being generous. I'll get this into the area it needs to be, and I've got a couple of cork cauls. Then I'll use a section of dowel as a caul in the tightest portion of the curve. I have to route channels for the truss rod and the carbon fiber reinforcement strips. Like the original, I'll run the carbon fiber up past the end of the nut there. The carbon fiber is held in place with a fairly quick setting epoxy, so I do them one at a time. Get them in there with just the right amount of the adhesive, and I have a nice flat block of phenolic. It's a countertop material used in the labs, which has been very dimensionally stable, so I use that as the clamping caul. It's a nice flat surface. I'm just getting ready to glue in some filler strips and little blocks to fill the gaps. I wanted to make sure there wasn't excessive tension on the truss rod before I did that, and I'm glad I did. This looks like a really nicely made rod, and it is, but the nut is non-standard. This is the kind of thing that drives repair people crazy, especially in guitars with adjustment inside the body, because you can't see what you're doing. You're working blind. For truss rods that are adjusted with Allen wrenches, also known as a hex key, by far the most popular size in the world is 4 millimeters. There are a few that use a 5 millimeter. We're talking imperial sizes. Fender often uses 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of an inch. Their bases 5/16. You will sometimes also see 5/32 rods occasionally now. That's about it. This one, 9/64. First and only time I've encountered one of these. You could spend $500 on the deluxe Stu Mac comprehensive truss rod set and you would be out of luck. It's a size that's rare to the point that you won't even find it included in your usual SAE homeowner grade collection of 15 or 16 keys you buy at the hardware store. You'd need to go and get the full automotive set. These days you could order a single one from Amazon. You'd have to find out what the size was though, right? So in instances like these, I become a vandal and mark the size down for the next person, because you really don't want to use the wrong wrench on this. I'm going to glue the head plate into position, and to make sure that it stays where I want it, I'm going to super glue some alignment keys to the face of the headstock just to keep it from moving. Got a whole forest of clamps as I also glue on the heel block. I'll mark the new taper on the fretboard and then plane and sand the edges to the appropriate shape. I'll drill holes for alignment pins into the neck through the fretboard, then mark the shape of the heel on the butt end, and I'll cut out a heel cap out of a piece of rosewood. I'll want the surface of the insert nuts that I'll be putting in here to be below the surface of the heel after it's been cut to shape and fitted against the body, so I have to make a little trench for those. After the alignment pins are inserted, I'll glue on the fretboard using surgical tubing as a clamping medium. Carving the heel involves making large sweeping facets to start off with, and then gradually increasing their number until we've got something of a three-dimensional picture of the object we're trying to cut. I'm going to make the volute terminate in a semicircle, so I'll mark that out. After the initial carving, I'll further refine the heel using rasps and scrapers and files, and then sandpaper. Replicating the neck shape from the tracings is done by first measuring off facets, which I will transfer onto the blank, make nice straight lines. The neck blank had previously been flush trimmed to the shape of the fretboard using a router bit. I'll use a thin saw to cut along the line, which I'm using for my measuring purposes, to the end of those facets. Then I'll chisel out those areas using a wide chisel. This is going to give my spoke shave a place to start, so I'm not trying to slide in from thin air. Look at my filthy floor. Look at the buttery smooth shavings coming off the spoke shave. Then I'll repeat the layout process using smaller facets, which run across the ones that are already on there. Then I'll blend the heel into the neck shaft. And I'll carve the transition from the head into the neck. The facets are blended together using some sandpaper on a flat block, followed by shoe shining with 150 and 180 grit. Rasps and scrapers help in the areas of transition. I'll plane off the excess headstock material down to the level of the original head plate. And I'll drill out the tuner holes. This is a fairly light colored piece of mahogany. It'll eventually darken down with exposure, but I wanted to give it a head start with some gel stain. Here I'm flat sanding the face of the headstock. Some more gloss lacquer is going to be shot across this. And, well, the whole thing is going to be gloss lacquer. I'll knock it back on the neck shaft proper because this player likes a satin sort of finish. I wrap tape around a colored pencil until it's a really good snug fit in the hole, and I'll use that to transfer the position for the bolts. Nothing is ever the right size. I have to shorten these bolts a bit. Here are the insert nuts. The pilot holes have to be sized precisely because I don't want to crack the heel from too much pressure, and these are going to get glued in place as well. Relieving extra material from the inside of the heel makes less sanding when it comes time to fit it to the body. I like to do this as a sloping shoulder rather than having a hard right angle or square shape. I think this probably stands up to the rigors of string tension a little bit better. In some cases you'll see they'll actually crush. At this point it's very much like a standard neck reset. I've got the bolts in place, holding the neck on loosely, and then I'll use sandpaper pulls to achieve the correct angle. In this case though, I also have to achieve the correct length of the neck so that we end up with decent intonation. We want a good tight fit between the parts. We also want to make sure the neck center line matches up with the center line on the body, and to achieve that we use sideways pulling. Once the proper neck angle is achieved, we don't want to mess with it, so things go out the sides. This is delicate because the grain, just the way it's oriented, wants to split off right on the corners, so this requires a light touch. I'm frequently checking the string line between the nut and the saddle, and I need to make sure that the string length is achieved so that the break points fall within the width of the saddle. When I'm satisfied, I'll snug up the neck bolts and glue the extension back down. I'll clean off the fretboard surface and then use a radius sanding block to re-establish the radius, which in this case is 16 inches. At this point it becomes a standard refret. Sort of a standard sized wire, no real surprises or abnormalities. Snip snip, file file. Here's one of those regularly occurring annoyances. When I installed the fret here, a little piece of the edge of the slot chipped away, and I have to fill that now with some ebony dust. It's far more annoying doing this after the fret has been installed, because cleanup is more difficult. You'll note that the entire board looks rather nasty right now, but that's because it hasn't been cleaned. There are various operations that have to take place involving sanding and stuff, so it doesn't make sense to do it until it's time. Yeah, there's one grain line that was a little bit insecure, I guess. Leveling, recrowning. I'm doing a Martin style angled slot nut where the base follows the angle up from the headstock. Mostly because it's been a little while since I've done one and I want to keep in practice. Like that. This has 5 light coats of lacquer on it over top of a seal coat of shellac. I'm keeping with the original. I'm making the headstock portion quite glossy. I'm polishing it up. The player does not like a slick surface on the back of the neck, so I use some 320 grit sandpaper and a Scotch-Brite pad. You could use satin lacquer, but I find that your average player will make that polished again within about a year of heavy use. I find that putting physical scratches into the neck is probably the best way. Strings on. These are elixirs. I gotta tell you, I was so happy because I put the strings on and the saddle was perfect. I did not have to change the height, and the intonation was absolutely bang on. First time out of the gate. The odds of that happening are astronomical. I was overjoyed.
Well, it's all back together. I hope this gives some indication of the amount of work that's involved in a job like this. It's not to be entered into lightly. Building a neck from scratch is a challenging process, but replicating one is an order of magnitude more. This is interesting. When I was fretting, I got confused up here because, like, which one am I doing? And then I realized, oh, we got a 16th fret marker rather than a 15th. Sneaky. So how would I characterize it? Well, it's a big guitar. It's got a really big sound, a lot of volume. It's not a Martin. It's not a Gibson. It is its own thing. And it does it pretty well.